We laid off of FTX last week a little bit just to kind of let let the dust settle. And it looks like we've got some additional pieces of information. Is it possible that SBF and his three, completely unexperienced cohorts were just patsies? Anyways, we're gonna dive into an article out of the New York Post and also this weird post on Facebook. Pretty interesting stuff that actually suggests that really it could have been somebody else that was responsible for what was really happening at FTX, maybe even somebody close to the regulatory framework. FTX's chief regulatory officer, Dan Friedberg, tied to online poker scandal. Now, even though the New York Post released this on November 20th, 2022, this scandal took place well over a decade ago. So it's kind of interesting that we don't hear his name too often. So everybody, let's all meet Dan and what Dan was responsible for over there. The top regulatory officer at fallen shitcoin exchange FTX once served as an attorney for a company that was embroiled in a notorious online poker cheating scandal more than a decade ago and was caught on tape allegedly aiding the perpetrators of the fraud. Dan Friedberg, a lawyer who was FTX's chief regulatory officer in the months leading up to its collapse and who also did a stint as its general counsel, also had served as an attorney for Ultimate Bet, whose collapse was considered one of the largest online gambling scandals in history at the time. In the alleged scheme, which reportedly claimed actor Ben Affleck amongst its victims, employees between 2005 and 2008 were accused of using a software exploit dubbed God Mode to bilk players out of anywhere from 20 and upwards of $50 million. Friedberg, who reportedly resigned from FTX earlier this month as it filed for bankruptcy, appears to have since scrubbed his LinkedIn account, which now displays a message: "This page doesn't exist." In 2008, the Kanawagi Gaming Commission, the Canada-based regulatory body that licensed Ultimate Bet, said it found clear and convincing evidence that Russ Hamilton, an Ultimate Bet co-owner and consultant, was the main person responsible for the scam, along with a handful of accomplices. Friedberg's involvement surfaced after recordings of his conversation with the poker site's top brass was leaked to the public in 2013. Friedberg can be heard on tape discussing how Ultimate Bet should respond and handle media inquiries. Friedberg also advised company executives on a strategy to limit payouts to victims by withholding the extent of the scheme. That's awful, awful. I think for the public, it just has to be former consultant of the company took advantage of a server flaw by hacking into the client, unable to identify exactly when, Friedberg allegedly said on tape, dictating a script in a bid to shortchange victims of the fraud. Friedberg even advised Hamilton to claim he was also a victim of the scandal because otherwise it's not going to fly. He acknowledged on tape that the liquidator for Excapsa, the software firm that owned Ultimate Bet, had $47 million on hand for potential payouts, but that executives wanted to limit the total to no more than $5 million. At one point in the recording, Hamilton admitted his guilt while directly addressing Friedberg. In its 2008 segment, 60 Minutes reported that jurisdictional issues had prevented any criminal charges from being filed against Hamilton and others implicated in the scandal. The audio tapes revealed Friedberg's involvement did not surface until years after the Kanawagi Gaming Commission released its findings. Friedberg's past raised alarm bells in the cryptocurrency sector long before FTX's downfall. In August 2021, cryptocurrency news site CoinGeek noted that FTX's decision to tap Friedberg as its chief regulatory officer was almost comically inappropriate given his past. There we go. Famous picture of SBF. If you hit up Dan Friedberg's LinkedIn, there's no mention of his time at the poker site. There's no mention of it. Yet he's the chief effing regulatory officer of FTX, which is a big effing job, Cohoda said. Either FTX knew they hired a chief regulatory officer who was part of a card cheating scandal, Either they knew that or he covered it up and got hired, Cahoda added. There's also this post on LinkedIn that was referenced in a tweet, and this is what it says. It says Dan Friedberg did it. SBF is just the fall guy. Biggest fraud in history. Misdirection. Now look, I'm not going to go through that entire Facebook post. I'm putting it in the show notes for all of you guys to go through it if you want. My point is this, right? We are all paying attention to SBF and his incompetence. We're all paying attention to his 3 cohorts, which also seemed equally as incompetent, if not even more incompetent. But the reality is, there's a regulatory officer. There's a regulatory officer that helped facilitate all of this. Now, the argument could also be made that, hey, SBF and his team members, they were just told, listen, you just keep it what you're doing and you let me handle the regulatory framework, and I'll make sure that all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. And that could be what also happened. But I got to say this, from about 3 weeks of diving into FTX, it's really interesting that the Dan Friedberg news came out back in 2021. Nobody cared, right? Because everybody was making money, so nobody gives a shit. And then it was completely silent until all of a sudden that information started to come back up again. Because you need to ask yourself, when an exchange loses over $10 billion, okay, you need to ask yourself, what exactly were the regulatory officers doing? What was the regulatory officer doing? And in the worst part of it, this particular person has a checkered history of providing false narratives to push through scams, as we saw with Ultimate Bet. Anyways, we told you a couple of weeks ago the FTX story still has legs. This is part of it. We're going to continue to cover it as it continues to fall apart. Make no mistake, this was not done in ignorance. This was done intentionally, and now we have another player who's quickly trying to erase themselves out of the equation, so that all we're left with is these 4 incompetent people that didn't know how to run an exchange, didn't know what they were doing, and just lost it all. I don't think it's that simple. I think there's somebody else there, and I think the regulatory officer may have something to do with it.